Hi there. I'm Gwen Raimondi, and I'm a marriage and family therapist associate here in the state of Washington. And I am creating this video series as an introduction to my next circle, Unleashing Our Mothers, Unleashing Ourselves, which is a 6-month journey of exploring our relationships with our female ancestors, looking at our relationships with our own mothers, looking at the relationships between our mothers and our grandmothers, looking at how we interact with our own daughters, and then even going further back in time and understanding how the pain, how the trauma, how the ways of being were passed down through the generations, and why this is a reaction to living in the culture we live in. There'll be 3 videos in the series. This is the first one, and today I'm going to talk about mother-daughter relationships specifically, and then I will talk about other pieces of the puzzle, so to speak, in relationship to how we interact with other women. And we'll also be talking about what I have coined as cultural relational trauma, which is how our culture impacts us and how we relate to other people. So mother-daughter relationships, they're complex, right? If you Google mother-daughter relationships, you will get pages and pages and pages about how to repair your mother-daughter relationship and how to know if you are in a toxic mother-daughter relationship and how to be respectful of your adult daughter, and right on and on and on and on and on. What I find interesting about that is not that all these articles exist, but rather that we have been so disconnected from each other. We've become so disconnected from our own mothering as mothers ourselves. We have become disconnected from our mothers and from our relationship with our elders. I don't mean a respectful relationship. I don't mean an authoritarian relationship, but rather a connected relationship. We live in a culture where we are told not to trust women, right? Don't trust women. Women are liars. There's an article that was published a couple years ago about how we raise our children to think women lie, right? This is part of our culture. This is how we're conditioned, that women are untrustworthy. We're told how our bodies are sin. We're told we can't trust our bodies. We don't know our bodies. We're told this from day one, and that is emphasized even more when we become pregnant, right? Obstetrics, and let me be clear, I am deeply grateful and thankful for modern medicine, and it also disconnects us from our own knowing, right? And we let go of our autonomy and our authority over our own bodies because somebody else went to medical school and they, quote, know better, right? Even though they didn't live in my body, even though they don't know what's normal for my body, even though they don't, right? We're trained to do this. This is part of it, right? This is part of us giving up ourself and who we are and our autonomy and our individualness, our individuation, right? This impacts our mother-daughter relationships because when we go out into the world, we are going out as women, as young women, we are going out into a world that does not like us very much, and in fact hates us and dehumanizes us. We are going out into a world that objectifies women. We are going out into a world where women are, their sole purpose, our sole purpose is to serve men, right? To serve them sexually, to serve them dinner, to serve them as, beautiful trophy wives on their arms, to serve as a status figure for them, right? That's part of the objectification of women, is that we are not our own human beings, right? So we go out into this world. We go out into this world where we are objects, where the rape statistics are, 3 out of every 5 women are raped. That's what's reported. Those are the reported rapes, right? That's what's reported. And we all know, we are all fully aware that all rapes are not reported, right? Again, it's around 2 to 3 out of every 5-ish women are physically assaulted by their intimate partners, physically abused, domestic violence. Again, that's what's reported. On average, 3 women every day, on average, 3 women are murdered by their intimate partners, by a boyfriend, by a husband, by an ex-boyfriend or husband. Murdered. This is the world that our mothers sent us out into. This is the world that we are sending our daughters out into. This is the world that our grandmothers sent our mothers out into. A world where, statistically speaking, we're fucked, right? Literally and figuratively, right? Where if we make it out alive, and by out, I mean to age 80 or 90, right? Because we all die, right? But if we make it to that point, that's success. And how do we make it to that point? We make it to that point by leaving our bodies, by not being connected, by just laying there and letting whatever needs to happen, happen, right? We get there by learning to play the game, by learning to be quiet, by learning to speak when spoken to, and to speak demurely when we are speaking, right? We learn to take up as little space as possible. And this is all taught to us, not only by our culture, but it is definitely taught to us by our culture. It is part of our cultural training, for sure. We're also taught it by our mothers. Even when we may have a great relationship with our mother, right? There is a tension and a sense of how do we do this? How do we send our babies out into the world that is a world that is going to harm them? And we know they're going to be harmed. I have an almost 10-year-old daughter, and these questions are very, very up in my head. What am I doing to prepare her for the world? To prepare her to survive? And I find my own intergenerational training, my own intergenerational conditioning, my grandmother's voice. Wow, man, her tone can come out sometimes, and I'm just like, ooh, it's like I'm possessed. I'm not kidding. And it is that part of, well, if you act the right way, you're going to get by, right? And we know that's not true. Of course, we know that isn't true, right? We know that in our bodies that isn't true. And yet we are harsh with our daughters in ways that perhaps we aren't with our sons. We condition our daughters to be a certain way, and our mothers did it to us and their mothers to them. And it was passed down and down and down and down. I am not saying all this to say mothers are to blame for everything, right? Mothers are the root of all evil. I don't believe that. I very much don't believe that, because I don't believe I am the root of all evil as a mother. And I also know that we live in a culture that does not support mothers, that does not support women, that does not support families, right? We live in a culture where it is not safe for us to report rape or domestic violence, where rapists receive incredibly lenient sentences if they're even convicted, right? And the same of perpetrators of domestic violence, if they get sentenced, if they go to trial, then the sentencing is nothing, right? 6 months, 3 months. 3 months and they're out in 6 weeks on good behavior. Good behavior, right? For beating the holy living shit out of their wife. That's the world we live in, right? So, of course, our mothers are doing all that they can to not only help themselves survive, but also help us as their daughters. That comes through as a feeling of betrayal. And in many ways it is. In many ways it is. It's acquiescing to a culture that hates us, that oppresses us, that dehumanizes us, that objectifies us. It is being complicit. It is being compliant. It is all of those things. Absolutely. And so, of course, as daughters, we feel betrayed. And we feel like, why didn't you stand up for me? Why didn't you protect me? Why didn't you fight this culture and change it? There could be any number of reasons, right? There could be any number of answers for that. And I think it boils down to, in many ways, fear of dying, fear of death, fear of a fate worse than death coming to themselves, our own mothers, or coming to their daughters. When we look at intergenerational trauma, and I'll talk about that more in another video, but when we talk about how trauma is passed down through the generations, there's the study of epigenetics, which shows how trauma is in our DNA and how it is part of it's part of our DNA. It's part of who we are. It's a mutable trauma. It's a mutable marker, which means that it can be changed, right? We can heal it. And right. So we have all of this pain and trauma of our ancestors. And if we look back far enough, depending on our culture, depending on our heritage, depending on our bloodlines, the color of our skin, where our origins come from, we can start finding the stories of how the women were brutalized. And sometimes it's very recent, right? Very recent times, relatively recent times. If you think about the slave trade in Europe and the United States, and how women were sexual slaves, women were raped, Black women, African women were raped, their children were taken away from them, were sold off into, they never saw them again. They were raped by their slave owners. They were betrayed by the slave mistress, by the wife of the slave masters. They were, and then often they were also experiencing violence within the slave community between each other, right? So women were being raped by then other slave men. And if that doesn't, that impacts us, right? That impacts us. That impacted our ancestors, and that has been passed down in the Black communities in the United States and in Europe. You go further back, you need to go further back in some ways for white women in looking at European culture particularly, and looking at the witch trials, which lasted hundreds of years, which wasn't just, a couple of women in Salem. This was going on across Europe for hundreds of years. Women were burned alive. Women were drowned. Women had their entrails ripped out of them, right? In front of their daughters. This was happening. Women were, betraying each other right and left because they needed to survive, or they needed to protect their daughters, so they turned their neighbor in, right? This is all in our genetics, that trauma of witnessing, of being part of, being complicit, of not being able to speak out because it would kill us, right? You can look at, we can go across the globe. I could go across each continent and we would have, example after example of how women were hunted, how women were slaughtered, how women were murdered, how women have been treated as property over and over and over, generation after generation. And it actually has not been safe for people to speak up. Safety being a relative term. And so all of that trauma lives in us, right? All that trauma from our ancestors, all that unresolved, unprocessed trauma is in us. We have any of our own number of lived experience traumas that happen. And then we know the statistics of what will happen to our children when we send them out into the world. What is likely to happen to our children, to our girl children in particular. And while our mothers may not have had the statistics that we know today, they certainly had their lived experience. And they had the stories of their friends and their peers. And they knew what the world was like. And it impacts how we interact with our daughters. And then it impacts how we interact with our mothers, right? And that relationship gets just fucked up. It just does. Because there's so much pain, and there's so much trauma, and there's so much of this unconscious trying to survive, right? That we aren't able to connect, and we aren't able to see the ways in which we potentially are safe enough to speak out and say no more and not continue on the conditioning. There's no easy or right answers, right? There's no easy way of unraveling this. It is a lot of deep work, and it's generations worth of work, right? I don't believe that once I get all my shit together, because really, that, the world's going to be beautiful and perfect for my daughter. The truth is my daughter is going to have work that she needs to do too. And probably if I have granddaughters, they will have some work too. But the hope is always, if we do our work, right? If we continue the work that some of our mothers did, right? So that it's that much easier for us in the world. And then we make it maybe that much easier for our daughters. And then our daughters make it maybe that much easier for our granddaughters. Right? And by easier, I mean less oppressive. I mean that we walk in the world feeling comfortable in our own skin. That we don't feel shame for simply being born female. That we can learn to have loving, connected, healthy, boundaried relationships with our mothers and with our daughters. And that we can learn new or really very, very old ways of being with each other. So, that is all for today. And again, this is as an introduction to the next my next 6-month circle, which is Unleashing Our Mothers, Unleashing Ourselves, where we will be exploring our relationships with our moms and their relationships with their moms, our relationships with our grandmothers, and our greater ancestral relationships, and how that all flows to us and how we can begin to unravel it. And if you'd like to learn more, you can, of course, go to the link below if you're watching this on YouTube, or if you are seeing this on my blog, then there's a link to the circle there too. Okay, sending you love, and I'll have another video next week.